Greetings, shippers. Welcome back, and it's time for another episode of Fanversations. Today, we're joined by Claire, fellow YouTuber and patron. She has her own channel on BookTube. BookTube being the side of YouTube where they talk about books and only books. She discusses a wide variety of books, especially sci-fi and genre works, from a wide array of perspectives. So please, if you're interested, check her out. I will have all of her links down below. And if you've been here for a while, you know she's the reason we have less of that ring light glare in my glasses. So special thanks to Claire. Extra special thanks. Thank you so much. Today, we're going to chat about Buffy. Surprisingly, for the first time on my channel, we're going to talk about the fandom, the impact, and much more. Because of course, you know we can never stay on just one topic in one of these. Come on now. As always, follow me on social media to stay up to date with what is coming up next with my erratic and crazy schedule, which is also why you should hit that bell notification so that you never miss a video. Now, if you're ready to listen to two fangirls chat about Buffy and sundry, well, this is the video for you. Let's get started. Greetings, shippers. It's Sasha from Shipper's Guide here with...
Hi, I'm Claire, and I am a YouTuber, podcaster, and fangirl. So I do a YouTube channel about books, mostly science fiction and fantasy, and I do a podcast about fandom, and so you can find me also on Twitter a lot, talking about all the things.
And I will put all of those good links down below. And we are going to be tackling a big fandom today because you actually emailed me and you were like, has anybody claimed Buffy yet? And actually no one has claimed Buffy. You are the first. I'm not sure what that says about the state of the Buffy fandom, but yes, you are the first.
But that's super cool because like I saw you doing Fanversations like on your Patreon and I was like, oh, I should get on that. And then like I saw that immediately, like the first episode was about Harry Potter and I wasn't at all surprised. But then I was like, what fandoms do I have that I know you're like in as well that we could talk about? And I, you know, like my main fandom is Les Mis and I'm like, that's probably fairly niche. So, you know, so yeah, Buffy, that is, you know, is maybe not something that I would say is my main fandom at any time, but it's been so long lasting. It's been so like important for such a long time. Mm-hmm. I thought it would be really interesting to like look at the breadth of it.
Yeah, I think for me, Buffy was one of the first shows where I actually got into a canonical like fanship because I enjoyed Spike and Buffy a lot. Yeah. And it was one of the first ones where I actually got really actively involved in caring about the relationship aspect of a show. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, same. I mean, I got into Buffy probably before I was Fannish about anything else in like a fandom way. I think I got into Buffy around the same time that I was reading the Harry Potter books for the first time, but like before my family had the internet. So, you know, like I'm in my 30s and when I was growing up in France, like we got the internet when I was like 16 or something. And by that point I was already into Buffy. And so I guess the way that I was excited about Buffy was like talking about it to my friends, but not necessarily like getting super invested in fan works, because when I got into fandom, it was really a Harry Potter thing for me. And so like, I guess now I'm kind of getting more fandom-y about Buffy and like revisiting it and caring about it in a different way. But like, it was always about the show and the canon for me in a way that loads of my other fandoms really aren't.
What I found interesting about Buffy, because the same for me, like we didn't get the internet until I was about, I think, maybe like 12 or so. And so when I first started looking online, like the internet was such a new thing. I didn't really know where to look. I certainly wasn't going on looking for any forums. I didn't even know that they existed, that there was anything like that where people were going and talking about their ships, the characters, writing fiction. Like I didn't learn about that for years later when I started making my own fan stuff. So going back over Buffy is very fascinating because it's going back into a fandom where I really wasn't a part of it at its zenith of when people were the most passionate about it. And so it's really fascinating to see like the ship wars and stuff. I just find it's like, wow, some of the insults are classic. It's amazing.
But that's amazing to me too, because like the way that, you know, because I grew up in France and I was watching the show when it was airing on French TV, so it was after it was airing in the US because they took time to dub it and everything. It, you know, it came out later and everything, so like even if I'd been going online to talk about Buffy, I would have been like in a minefield of spoilers. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why I never really did, is that, you know, for me it was super separate in terms of like this was something that I did like in French with my friends, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I was a tiny little bit into like Friends fandom around that time in high school. Like I was like on forums talking to people about Friends, but it just never did so for Buffy. And I think it's just because I was like super invested in where like the actual story was going.
I was just based on what you were saying, it just a question popped into my head, which was, do you think when you're really involved in the ship and you're fangirling something really hard, do you think that you're laxer about spoilers? Because I know personally when I'm shipping something, I'm a bit less concerned about the spoilers.
I mostly don't care about spoilers now, but I think at the time I really did. And I, you know, like I was also like a baby fan in many, many ways. Like I remember watching season 4 or 5 of Buffy. Like I also got into it in a really weird way. But I remember watching season 4 or 5 when Tara shows up, and like I was, you know, 13, 14, and like I'm straight, and I was watching and I was like, oh yeah, they're friends. Like an adult, and I was like, whoa, okay. It's like very, very, you know, I mean, obviously they are like really into each other from the beginning, and
yeah.
Oh, bless your tiny like cotton socks of like not seeing anything, you know. Like it's just one of the main reasons why when people say, you know, oh well, there totally could be like queer ships in Harry Potter because Harry is just like a straight 13-year-old boy, sees nothing. I'm like, yes, that works. But yeah, I just the experience of watching that show for the first time was like nothing else for me, because it was still at the time where it was on TV. You had to catch it every week, and if you miss it, you missed it. You had to tape it. I got into the show because my best friend who was watching it asked me to tape the end of season 2 for her because I was going on holiday or something. I can't remember, but you know, like the first episode that I saw was Becoming Part 2 because I taped it for my friend. So after that, I was like, that show is weird. And then I only got back in like season 4 or something. And then I went back later and rewatched all of it. And it was kind of like a weird, like going back to see a prequel with this guy Angel that I don't care about because he's not Spike.
I think that happened to me too, because I started watching and I jumped in from season 2 the first time that I watched it. And so most of the important Angel stuff happens in season 1. Arguably that's the big great love of her and Angel and all of that. And so I had passed that and we were in really mopey, I'm Angel, I don't want to be Angelus and all of that stuff. And so when I went back and watched season 1 later, I couldn't really get into it. I think that I think that affects shipping in ways that people don't really think about, where you start and when you start, because there's such a difference versus like starting at the beginning and going all the way through, jumping in the middle, or even coming in after. Like I think for people who are coming into Buffy now, it's a very different landscape than coming into it while it was airing and going through all of that.
Right, because I think it's really, really, I mean, I would be very, very shocked if someone was telling me now that they were watching Buffy for the first time and they had not known from the zeitgeist that Angel was a vampire. At any, you know, like, and that wouldn't be anyone's fault, but it's like, can you now start watching Game of Thrones with 0 spoilers? You probably can't. You know, or Harry Potter, like, you probably can start reading the books or whatever, but you're going to have these moments where it's like, oh yeah, I remember hearing about that, and now this joke makes sense, and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's not the same experience. And also, I think it's not the same experience now because a lot of the conversations that we have about some of the core themes of Buffy have kind of moved forward a little bit. You know, I mean, it is a show that talks a lot about feminism, and our conversations on that have really changed. And some of the things, when you rewatch them now, they feel really a bit more uncomfortable than they did probably at the time.
I really like it as far as a feminist show, because what I like about it in that sense is I do enjoy that it allows Buffy to be feminine and to also have all of these kick-ass features.
And I think that's something that, you know, was really great, because when I was watching Buffy as a teenager, I never analyzed it in that way, but obviously it becomes, you know, internalized. And I really like the fact that, you know, you have a character like Cordelia, for instance, who starts completely as the queen bee, but then it's like, well, you know, you can't really, like, she is a sympathetic character, whether she is placed as a minor antagonist sometimes, you know, or someone, an obstacle, you know, she is still like a good guy, and we know that, you know. And then of course when you watch Angel, even more so. So I quite like the fact that it kind of goes, you know, against so many of those stereotypes.
That brings up a good question, because I was actually talking with somebody else the other day, just in the comments chatting, and they brought up the point that they don't think that Spike and Buffy would be as popular now as it was back in the day, because they feel that people wouldn't let it develop and they would get it mired down in like a Raylo-esque kind of conversation where it's just like, it's abusive, end of story, we don't want to see it, we're done. Because a lot of fandom, it seems like, is very quick to jump on what they assume a relationship is before allowing it to develop. Like, I would say the same thing even happens with a popular ship like Clans, where people are like, it's canon, it's endgame, that's what's happening, and we're going that way. And so then when things don't match up with that, then you end up with a Raylo situation where you're watching, say, The Last Jedi, and you're like, what is happening? Or like a Clans, where you're like, you know.
So I haven't actually been to The Last Jedi yet because of the holidays and going to see my family and that. So just
don't worry, I won't spoil you. Like, but you,
I figured you wouldn't, but I thought I'd mention it anyway.
I'm sure you saw that trailer scene where he holds his hand out and they're playing the music. Like,
I mean, I get what you're saying, and I agree with you 100%. There would be a completely different conversation about it. Now, I remember talking about Buffy to my grandmother's neighbor at some point. Who, I mean, you know, their daughter, who was the same kind of age as me, and we were just talking. We were both watching, you know, as it was unfolding, and I was like, I really liked Spike, and I, you know, because I loved Spike as a character, I was happy to see them get together on the show. And I think she was just like, what are you talking about? Like, that is not good, you know? And it's certainly true that it's not healthy, but I think, you know, if you can't really look at, you know, season 5, 6, 7 of Buffy and not say, like, there are some conversations there about mental health that need, you know, that are just, they're not about Spike and Buffy, they're about Buffy, you know, and what she's going through. And certainly it's an unhealthy coping mechanism, and there are a lot of things in the show that I'm like, I wish they hadn't put it quite, I wish they hadn't pushed it quite that far. I wish they had made certain things clearer. I mean, I obviously wish that there wasn't the attempted rape. I maintain that the intention, that Spike's intentions at the end of season 6 when he gets reinstalled, to me were not clear for the longest time. Like, I had a discussion with a friend of mine where I was like, well, clearly he wanted to, like, go back to when he was evil and had no feelings, like, you know. And he was like, no, he's saying, like, make me like I was, like, he means like William, you know. And I know that there's been some, I know that at some point Joss Whedon has, like, weighed into that and said, like, this is what I meant, but it's not clear in the final, you know, in the final text. If we want to, you know, talk about analysis and call the final thing a text, then, you know, you can't tell someone they've read it wrong. Like, you didn't make it clear. There's plenty of stuff like that I'm like, it makes it really difficult to kind of have these conversations about morality and judgments and whatever, because, like, I thought vampires were, like, descended from demons, but like Angel has a soul, but you always kind of talk about him as if him and Angelus were the same thing. And then Spike doesn't have a soul, but you're like hanging out with him. And then Anya never has a soul, and no one cares that she never has
And
a
no
soul.
one cares that she's just part of the gang,
like,
and it's all a good time. And
like, I love Anya. And she has so many great moments, you know, like what my favorite Anya moment is in the body, where she's trying to wrestle with the concept of mortality, and I think that's really great. And I just wish they had like kind of leaned into thinking about those things a bit more, you know?
Definitely, because it's true that the characters aren't treated evenly. For like the way the gang treats Spike is very different than the way they treat some of the other people, like Angel or again Anya. It's just a very uneven playing field in how they treat the characters who, if you look at them, you could say, well, they kind of have the same thing going on, so why him this and why him that? But at the same time, when it comes to that end of season 6, which I think is where a ship like Spuffy really loses a lot of people, because they can't get past that, and that is too much for me. Moments like that never really stop me from shipping a ship if I ship it, because for me that's what fan fiction is for. There are ways to explore what is attempting to be done and stuff in the fan fiction itself. And sometimes, for me, when I watched that scene, I always just felt it was very much a mistake and mishandled. So in my headcanon, it was just kind of like, didn't happen. Because when they went to season 7 and then they tried to explain it, and Buffy was all sympathetic about it, and she understood where he was coming from, but then you have that scene, but then it was like people wouldn't let her have that understanding for him. And that was very difficult for me, because I was like, it's her, if she wants to deal with it that way, and she has that understanding because he's a vampire and resold, and there are all these circumstances. I didn't really feel like at that point you could apply real world arguments to it, which is how I feel about a lot of supernatural ships in general, because I'm like, if I start thinking like that, then already they're all way older than her. What is Angelus doing?
Know, right? You know? Like, I'm sorry, you're like 500 million years old, like stop perving outside of the high school. And this girl who has her heart in her hand. Oh wait, that one creepier though. You know, like they highlight it on the show sometimes. You know, that scene in Amends where like Angel and Buffy are talking, and he's like, "You had your heart in your hand," and he's, "Oh wait, no." Like, they acknowledge that there's some weirdness there. I just think it's just, if there was more consistency, it would be easier, because you know, like, how many times has, say, Xander, for instance, treated Angel and Angelus as the same person because like he's not happy with him as a partner for Buffy? Like, how many times, like, you know, Anya gets made into a human. She's unhappy about it. She complains about it a whole lot. And, you know, whenever she gets made into a demon again, like, there's not a, only Spike knows, there's not really a change. Whereas I think, you know, there's a very marked behavioral change with Spike and with Angel, you know, when they're not vampires. And I haven't seen all of Angel at all, so I know that there are other characters in that probably that you could look at. I think if they had been a little bit more consistent with that, then it would have been really easy to say, like, you know, well, this is non-vampire, this is, you know, vampire Spike, and this is insult Spike, and they are different. And also they call him the same name, which doesn't really
because they don't start calling him William after he gets his soul back, which I'm kind of glad of, because with that look and everything, I'm like, William.
Well, but the one time that Buffy does it, then it has more
power.
Yeah, exactly. I think if they did it all the time, it would be, you know, and he's not telling them about the soul as well, so, you know, it just, I mean, I see what you're saying, that I think it would have a lot more, there would definitely, well, I'm sure there have been ship wars, I just wasn't in them, but I think
there were.
there would be many opinion pieces, many takes.
Yes, many different Tumblr blogs, many a Tumblr blog.
Oh yeah.
Do you think if the show was airing, let me rephrase that. Let me rewind that question. Do you think that people are a bit that they analyze Buffy a bit too much because of the space it's come to occupy in fandom. Like, Buffy is a very popular show, and it has this history of being this big genre moment, this big feminist show, this show that leads into there being able to be so many other genre shows.
Yeah.
Do you think that because of that, people maybe give it more weight or credence than it's worth when you go back and rewatch it again? Because sometimes I go back and I rewatch them like, this is a 90s time capsule. My goodness.
I think that's really a kind of a chicken and the egg question, you know, because I think the reason people analyze it like that is that it has value to them. You know, like if I don't like a show, if I don't like a movie or whatever, I'm just going to come out of it and be like, yeah, that was all right, and never think about it again. Like, this is how I feel about Guardians of the Galaxy 2. I was like, oh yeah, what happened in that film? Oh yeah, there was that weird, like, planet, you know, like, I thought it was hilarious when I was in the cinema. You know, there were things that bothered me about it, but mostly I thought it was good fun. I talked about it with my partner on the drive back, and that was literally it. You know, like, I had to struggle to remember what happens in it. So, like, for me, if you know, that is not something that has a lot of weight for me, because I am not affected by it, you know, emotionally in as much of a way. Whereas with Buffy, like, there are specific moments in the show that give me a specific feeling, you know, like, I am the kind of person who has a folder of GIFs on my computer, obviously, and images to pull up on Twitter sometimes if I know specifically which one I want. And so, like, you know, in that folder, I have every specific GIF from that sequence at the very end in the last episode where Willow does the spell, and then there's the voiceover, and then there's a little girl with her baseball cap, and, you know, it talks about how we're all going to fight back, and I just can't use that GIF without getting goosebumps. And I feel like, you know, if you find a piece of storytelling that gives you that kind of emotional response, like 20 years later, 25 years later, I don't even want to think about how old, 20 years later, probably. We had the anniversary recently. But if you find that, then, like, yeah, I want to keep talking about it. You know, like, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this with you and that I mentioned in my email is that, like, I am now on my second full episode by episode rewatch podcasts of Buffy that I've become a fan of, because I like their analysis of the show. You know, like, I listened to a podcast called the Buffy Rewatch the whole time it was going for, like, literally years. And when they were done, you know, I was like, that was a great experience. You know, I've thought about Buffy so much more. I really like it. And now I'm, like, super into this podcast called Buffering the Vampire Slayer, which is done by the hosts are a married couple, and they are both, like, one of them is a singer-songwriter and one of them is a queer activist, and they are, like, two amazing smart ladies, and they do a song for each episode of the show.
That's awesome.
Like, it's really, they have jingles, like, it's really well produced as well, which I think is just really, you know, like, it feels like a show as well, you know. And I feel like if there wasn't, for me, like, a strong base of emotions that go, you know, that shows brings up, and if there wasn't, like, a strong base of, you know, like, stuff that we can still talk about, like, you know, it's still interesting, and it's been so long and I've seen it and talked about it so many times. I just think, for me, I just can't help, you know, thinking about stuff like, I mean, it's the same with big fandoms like Harry Potter and things like that. Like, it was so significant at a specific time in my life, and I've, you know, thought about it so much since then. I just think, well, maybe, I don't know if it was, because I often think about that very question for Harry Potter, you know, because, like, I love it very dearly. It was one of my first fandoms and whatever, but I look back, and much like Buffy, some of the conversation points have kind of gone, you know, kind of past the level that we're at in the book. I wonder if it came around today, if anything would be, you know, if it would be at all similar, because we're in a different place. But I think we can't help the place that it actually, you know, like emotionally holds for us.
I guess a good question with that is that because conversations are always shifting and changing with time, and what we're discussing in society is always changing. But do you feel that with the newfound rapidity of social media and the internet and the ability to access each other's opinions and share each other's opinions, do you feel that sometimes newer works don't get a fair shake? Like they don't get a chance to develop the story where they're gonna go? Because I've seen that a few times, I think, where I've been watching something and it's the first episode and people are like, problematic, over it, done. And I'm like, whoa, it's the first episode. Like, give them time. Like, sometimes people have a story and it's going to take them a while to get to where they're going. But I feel that sometimes these days people want to see that development instantly, and so it can be difficult for someone who might be taking a character through a journey, or who might be having someone go through a change of opinion, maybe get that across, because people are very quick to announce what they view as, you know, problematic or not the best representation of that kind of thing.
I mean, I can see, like, immediately I can think of, like, at least 3 shows that I watched the first episode and I was like, and then I watched, like, 2 or 3 episodes and I was like, this is my favorite show of all time. You know, and I mean, granted, one of them was The Big Bang Theory and I ended up breaking up with it after a while. But, you know, because then it got terrible. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm looking back with rose-tinted goggles and it was terrible all along. But, you know, like, Parks and Recreation season 1 is not great, and the rest of it is, like, you know, one of my favorites. And for something more recent, I think The Good Place, you have to give it more than 1 episode, and that is, like, one of the, like, the storytelling on that is extraordinary. I'm someone who really likes to binge things anyway, so, like, if I see something, you know, and I know that I kind of tend to be a bit down on stuff. Rick and Morty, I also didn't like the first episode that I saw, and then after a while I got really into it. So, you know, I know that I have a tendency for that. I will always try and give it a few episodes. I think in terms of, like, stuff being problematic, partly I think it depends when we're talking about that, like, the judgment that we're making, like, if it's something that will personally, like, affect us. Like, if I'm seeing something that, like, whilst I'm watching it, it's making me upset, then I'm, like, not gonna keep going, and I'm gonna say, I stopped watching this because it was making me upset, and I think that's fine.
For me, maybe I'm a masochist. I will stick with most things, even if I hate it, and even if they're upsetting me, I will power through.
Oh, yeah.
And just to see, just because I want to know, and I always like to examine also if something is upsetting me. I like to take a step back and see why. I'm like, what is it about this specifically that is bothering me? Is it how it's presented? Is it the implication behind it? Is it mean-spirited? I find that's what gets me the most. I find that I can stick with things even if they're problematic, if I can tell the intentions are genuine or good, and I'm like, you know what? They're not quite getting it, but you know, they mean well. But when I'm watching something or reading something and it just comes across as very mean-spirited or cruel, that's when...
The Big Bang Theory?
The Big Bang, I could not get behind The Big Bang Theory because The Big Bang Theory was selling itself as this big, you know, nerd extravaganza of, like, yay, nerd culture and celebrating. And then I felt that it got very mean, you know?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I felt The Big Bang Theory, I was watching for, I think, 2-3 seasons, something like that. I remember I saw an episode of, I think, season 3 being taped when I was on holiday in LA one time. So, you know, at that point I still really cared about it. But I remember at the point that I saw it taped, like, some of the jokes in the episodes, I was just like, oh my God. And, you know, like, if you are at a point where, like, you're watching the thing being recorded, and you know, that's, like, a really great experience for a fan, and you're already like, oh, writing on this show, you know. So it's like, I you know, there's a whole thing about, like, laughing with you versus laughing at you.
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, whenever I read something about fandom or I watch something, you know, when fandom appears in media, like, you can tell when a fan wrote it. I'm saying wrote because a lot of what I talk about and stuff is books, but obviously fandom in any media, I think you can really tell, like, who's in, you know, the writing room or stuff like that. So I think it really comes across.
I'm planning on doing an episode on Supernatural, actually, and its representation of fandom, because it evolved and changed very much over time. Because when it starts, you can tell there's very much this sharp-edged barb of annoyance and not liking it and being quite frustrated with it. And then you get to the point where we're introducing Charlie, and the tone has just completely shifted. And now it's very positive and yay. But if you look at Charlie versus Becky, those are two completely different representations of fandom. And Becky is difficult for me because I very much feel that Becky, the show, wants you to laugh at her, whereas Charlie, the show, wants you to celebrate her. But Becky, because like some of the jokes are very like funny with Becky, and I laugh. But then there's that whole, but she's sad and lonely and no one really loves her, and it's because she's pathetic and writes fan fiction. And you're like,
Well, I mean, it's like every single time that like people go into the comic book store in The Big Bang Theory and like there's a woman and like everybody's like, oh my God, women read comics. And it's like, maybe the reason they don't go in your comic book store is that you're like terrible at selling comics. Like, I mean, maybe you should be better at like welcoming people into your store, because like my comic book store like has several women working there.
Same with mine.
You know, like when I go in my comic book store, they don't go like, oh, women. They go like, hi Claire, here's your books that you order regularly. Like, you know. It's a store. They don't like gawk at you. They take your money. It's what stores do.
Of course. They're happy when you walk in, especially these days when you can order it online. They're just thrilled you're there.
And I mean, it's not like they were in a kind of a small town. Like they are in LA. So like, or Pasadena or wherever. So like it should be not weird, you know, because I live in London. So obviously going to the comic book store in London is like not like everybody got, you know, like I'm sure people much weirder than me go to the comic book store. I think one of the things I always find the most difficult with shows that I watch, and especially shows that I love, is when like, and same with books, is when I can tell that the narrative is taking a position, and I don't agree with that position. I think it's season 4 or 5, like the episode where Riley leaves, and then Xander gives Buffy this like speech about why she should go after him because like he's great, and it's like, yeah, but then you should date him, Xander, like if you like him so much, like why like this is none of your business, you know. And like the fact that the way that it's filmed, it's the same actually when Xander and Willow are like briefly smooching behind Oz and Cordelia's back, where like the show is playing sweet music. And it's like, this is not romantic. Like, what? And it's not, you're watching it and you're like, I'm having bad feelings, but partly it's not because I don't like the storyline that the show is doing, because both of those things are things that I could see happen. Like, they're not unrealistic.
It's how it's presented.
Yeah, I can't really get behind it, and I'm feeling very uncomfortable that you, the show, are portraying it in that way.
Sometimes I even wonder if I took a lot of like I'm double majored in cultural studies when I was in school, and I always wonder if because there were tons of analysis classes, you know, analyzing film, discussing what was intended, and I'm always like, are we putting too much into it? Because when I see a scene like that with the sweet music and stuff, I also always think like, why would you? What are you doing? And then sometimes I think maybe they just didn't think about it. Maybe it's just a genuine.
Maybe what they're trying to do is go more into a specific POV as opposed to showing you this like impartial cheating is bad. Maybe they're trying to go more into Xander and Willow's specific personal points of view where this is happening.
Maybe the sound guy ships it. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
Because I feel that people forget that too, and that people on the creative staff also have their own favorite pairings, their own places that they want the show to go, that it sometimes does not go there.
One thing about shipping and one thing about fan culture, especially for ongoing shows as well, when we're like super invested and we have an idea of where it should go, and it's like, maybe it's just not the same idea that the showrunners do.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then like it sucks for you. Go read some fanfic, because it's not gonna happen, you know. Obviously there's loads of like tin hat theories about like this is definitely gonna happen in BBC Sherlock or whatever,
but
I mean, even stuff like, I was just listening to a recent episode of the podcast Fansplaining, which is really great fandom podcast, and they were talking to it's Elizabeth Minkill and Flourish Clink, and they were talking to Orlando Jones about Sleepy Hollow, and he was like, yeah, but it's called Sleepy Hollow. Like, obviously people think it's about Ichabod Crane, like, that are writing it. Like, maybe you watching it are thinking it's about other characters, but like, it's gonna, like, the writers are going into it with the gimmick of like, it's a, you know,
it's a Sleepy Hollow modernization update.
So,
yeah,
like, obviously he's the main character, and I think a lot of people, I haven't seen it, but I've had many conversations about it with a friend of mine who's really loves that show and is like, but I wanted it to be about this other character more. And it's like, yeah, but that's just not what the showrunners were doing. And,
I think Buffy is one of the fandoms where it's very lucky in that case, and that the focus very much stays on Buffy, even in fandom itself. Because I have seen fandoms where that doesn't happen. A good one of that is Teen Wolf, where Scott, lots of people don't even like Scott, and he just very much gets sidelined out of his own show because we're going to talk about Steric instead. But Buffy, very much that doesn't happen. And you mentioned that you got into Buffy a lot canonically. It was like you're very into following the canon. So now that you're older, are you more into the fandom side of it? Like vis-a-vis like fics, art, like how are you into that side of it?
I think Buffy for me is really interesting because it's one of the fandoms where I engage with it a bit differently than my other fandoms, you know, like where there's this, like, I am more into like just headcanons and discussing the actual canon of the show. There's this like super interesting to me anyway, like theory of types of fandom where people talk about affirmational fandom, which values like fact and knowing stuff about the canon more, and then like transformational fandom, which values like affect and feels basically, and like, you know, doing more creative stuff with your love of the show. And I'm mostly very transformational as a fan. Like, this is mostly what I care about for most of my shows. But for Buffy, I guess there are a lot of things that can be fixed in the show that, you know, that I would like to fix in the show. There's many reasons to have fix-its, but even then there's so much about it that I just like love and will quote. I'm perfectly happy with like a sing-along of the musical episode or like a quiz about Buffy, you know, or things like that. Like I engage with it quite differently. I guess I'm not, because like the heyday of the fandom is not right now. I don't feel like I'm in the fandom, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't know what Tumblrs to follow. I don't know if, like, you know, I'm in my 30s. I have trouble using Tumblr because, like, I'm old, you know, like this goes very fast and doesn't archive very well. I'm not happy with it. I don't follow a lot of people who regularly write Buffy fic. I'm mostly on AO3, and so I don't know if, like, you know, much like Harry Potter back in the day, like I'm sure there were like specific Buffy fanfic archives, and whether they've all been, you know, ported to the archive of our own, whether people write Buffy fic right now for the archive, I'm not sure, but I haven't really like kind of, I guess, gone into that. I think if I did, I'd want to read a lot more like genfic than like shippy stuff. You know, because I just like the show and the atmosphere of it, and I would just like to like be in that world for new things, you know. But I'm also not particularly interested in like the continuation comics, like season 8.
I was just gonna ask if you checked those out.
I mean, I've checked them out, but like they're comics, so they're quite expensive. And I'm just not.
And they don't sell them in small individualized packs either. It's either you're getting all of season 9 a compendium or nothing. So at least over here, that's how it is.
I have so many thoughts about how comics are sold in general, like, because they're packaged very differently in, like, you know, English language comics. Like, the way that they are being sold in the comic book industry is very different than like the like French and Belgian school of like graphic novels and stuff. It's just a completely different industry. And so coming from that one side, I'm like, what do you mean I have to buy like a tiny floppy thing and like keep a box of them in my house? Like, I just want a book. I like having books in my house. And so I buy volumes of everything. So if there's not volumes, I will find it, you know, like super difficult. Like, I've read the beginning of like season 8, season 9, whatever they call them. Like, I've read some of those online, and I'm like, it's one of those where I think I've heard some spoilers about, some stuff that happens, and it seems a bit too whack when, like, you don't read the story. It's like, Dawn turns into a what? And then does what? And Xander dates who? It's like, Or I think, yeah, that's probably an example of what you were saying, where, like, you hear something about it and you're like, oh, I don't want to give that thing a chance because it sounds too weird, whereas if I read it, I'd probably be on board with it.
It can also be difficult when a media transitions. Like, when you go from watching a show to reading a comic, they're very different mediums. So sometimes if you got into something one way, it can be difficult. Not necessarily. It depends on how you enjoy your material. But if you're, say, like, you're someone who only watches TV shows and you don't read comics at all, and all of a sudden it's like, here, enjoy this season 8 comic book. It's like, well, I don't know if I want that. So I can understand why some people aren't as familiar with the continuation, because there is fan fiction still produced, and some of it follows the continuation arcs, not so much. I find that what's the most different about fan fiction for Buffy now versus fan fiction when it was coming out at the time is that you lose the what if pairings. Because people know what the canons are. So, for example, there was that period where people were shipping Spike and Willow, and then there was a huge Xander and Spike bunch of shipping for season 5, and you kind of lose those ships when people know how things turn out. Yeah,
like I said, I think I would just want more, like, snippets of like, the banter and the just times that they have hanging out. I feel like, when you go towards, like, season 6 and it gets really dark and it's about Buffy's depression a lot, and then you get to season 7 and, like, the world is gonna end, but, like, properly this time, and there's all the potentials, and, it's really busy. And I feel like I would probably want more stuff that's kind of just them enjoying their lives, or I suppose, like, ships that I'm really shipping for Buffy, and I'm really behind. Like, I can ship Buffy Angel and Buffy Spike. Like, I think both of them work and are really interesting. But I would be really interested, I guess, now in, like, anything about Giles, because I love Giles. But like, I would love to see more Joyce and Giles. Obviously, that would have to be, like, earlier on, and it would have to be kind of like missing moments and snippets. But I would love to see just more of just them talking about their weird parent dynamic that they have. I
was all about Giles and Ethan back in the day. I was like, I need all of the fics about their insane past and their crazy adventures, please.
Okay. I would love, like, a kind of I would love a about Ethan and Ripper.
Yes.
And when they're, like, properly, like, kind of very young, and very young and very posh and very British and very kind of chaotic, neutral or whatever. It's one of the things. I mean, a character like Ethan Rayne, like, it's much like Loki, at his best, is like, chaos for chaos's sake, I quite like that. If I started reading Buffy now, I would be like, I must explore all the pairings. I must read a million different things. And then, like, once I've done that, I will go and, like, pick, like, this is my comfort pairing for this, for this fandom. I feel like possibly my fanfic consumption is a bit weird, because I read a lot of fic, but I really a lot of my main pairings are really fairly tragic, and a lot of people die at the end. So I'm, like, always reading, like, modern AU or like Fix It, and so I don't know. I think I'd be really interested in, like, a continuation, like, 10 years later, what is Buffy getting up to, and like, a, like, proper novel length, really well written thing about what Buffy's getting up to and who's in her life now, though that probably would need more original characters than I normally read. I feel the same about Gilmore Girls, where I'm like, oh, this is great, please give me all the, like, later on, like, what happens to them 10 years later is kind of fix, where they've sorted themselves out. And then
that Gilmore Girls revival, though.
And then the revival came out, and and it turned out that they had not sorted any of their shit
No,
out.
no. Rory was even worse. She had more things to sort out.
She was so much worse. It's just like, I have been, you know, since I first saw Gilmore Girls, a very staunch, like, future Rory and Jess shipper. Because I was like, I was into it on the show, but I could tell that it wasn't, like, good for them. But, like, maybe future. And now I'm like, run away, Jess Mariano. You're better off without her.
It's like, Jess, you've got your life together. Don't do this.
Don't do this.
I guess I wonder, how do you feel about revivals in general? Because like you said, like, there are fandoms that hit a core group of people and you stay with them and you enjoy them and you go through all the rewatches and they're still very much a part of your life. But how do you feel about when creators and shows actually try and bring that revival into being? Like, is there ever a chance that it will match what people dream up?
It's really tricky, right? Because the bigger the fandom, then the more opinions about what it should be like, you know? And I very much feel like once you've made a thing and you've put it out into the world, it's not just yours anymore, and you have to accept that. You know, you can't tell someone that they've read it wrong. You've put something out into the world and you've expressed your opinion of it by the making of it, and then it's out there and you're like, and, you know, if people watch it and they think, oh, well, this character should be with this character because clearly they have this great chemistry and they're in love, and you as a creator watch it and go like, but no, but this other person, like, well, the die is cast, you know, you can't
help how
that.
People interpret something.
Yeah, and like, you're putting something out and it's not, one story is not always just one story, you know, like, you as the creator of the story have brought all your life experience to it, and then you tell the story, and then someone with a different life experience to you is going to take something else out of it. Like, if it's the same exact words, right? If it's just a story with the same exact words, different people are going to, like, glom onto different bits. And then once you add, like, the fact that there's the A storyline and the B storyline and then the C subplot, and then, you know, different characters, different actors, different, you know, like, ideas and perceptions about relationships. I mean, I don't know. It's just, there's no possible way that even the first thing that you put out is going to resonate the same with everybody, right?
Definitely. I definitely feel that. I do feel that people can, for lack of a better word, interpret it wrong. Like, you lay out the clues and it's like A plus B equals C and they get F or G. But that's what happens because, like you said, people will interpret it. But it's an interesting thing because as an author, it is, or a creator of anything, it is still yours, but it's also people's. So then you do have that interesting relationship of having to navigate that something is yours and there is your interpretation and there is what you meant, but then there are the people who are accepting it and loving it and forming their own interpretations. And I find that the difficulty these days for creators is finding a way to meet in the middle and discuss in the middle.
Right, because
it can be hard, especially depending on how you feel about it, because I know some authors and creators are all for it and they love it and they love talking with fans and they love engaging, but I know some of them are a bit more reticent, and that I feel might be a bit difficult these days where it's so easy to be transparent. It may be a bit more difficult to be someone who's a bit more wanting to keep their work a bit, you know, closer to the chest.
And it's also difficult because in many cases, you know, if your work really strikes a chord and reaches, you know, this kind of fandom level, then it's more popular, people engage with it more, you're selling more copies of your book or your DVD or whatever, and then, you know, like, you can keep doing the thing and you make more money off of toys or whatever, you know, like, it's the difficult thing, right? Because there's a bit of, you know, what you've made and what you've created, there's a bit of, like, economic thing as well to it. You know, when, I mean, people talk about, you know, queerbaiting a lot and talk about audience, you know, like, trying to just please the fans, as if, like, that's completely always separate with making a good story. I don't know, you can definitely look at the early Harry Potter books and be like, Ron fancies Hermione, that's in the text. Like, you can't, like, maybe you don't agree and maybe you want to write something with a different ship, but you can't say
that it wasn't
not
there. It was
it's like
there.
It's really obvious. But then also, you know, when J.K. Rowling comes out and says something like, I intended for this, Like, fine, but like that's not in the text.
Yeah,
So
I find that very interesting when they talk about, because there's a very different thing about talking about intentions that you placed in the text and that maybe people just didn't resonate with it versus intentions you didn't put there. And that's what I find very fascinating about listening to J.K. Rowling and why I enjoy it so much, because she's very engaged in fan culture, but I find it an interesting way in that she often talks about her own work as if she's a fan of it herself, which I'm sure she is. But that's very fascinating, because then you have these discussions where she's talking about ships and pairings and characters and how she feels about them in ways that aren't necessarily represented within the work itself. So then it creates this interesting tier in the fandom of people who then try and use those words to justify their ships, where they're like, she said Hermione was what she wanted, hence our ship is the best ship. And you're like, well, no, like all ships, you know, let them ship.
And it's, and it's also got loads of different levels, right? Because she says something about like, oh, I think Hermione and Ron probably wouldn't be great as a like married couple later in life or whatever. They'd probably have counseling. And it's like, oh, it's like comments like that, spark outrage and whatever. And that's on one level. And then she's like, saying random things like, there's definitely queer people, they're just not in the text. There's definitely, like Dumbledore is gay. There's no disabled people because like you have magic illnesses, you don't have like muggle illnesses. It's like Harry has glasses, all these conversations that we have, about it that are like a little bit more about, like that are potentially way more hurtful to other people. That's in the same kind of realm as her saying like, fun fact, so-and-so's birthday is this day. And it's like, people want that, a lot of people in fandom are like, oh my God, can she like stop because the thing has been done and, we have it and it's great and whatever. But then like loads of people are happy that she is giving them more.
Yeah, did you enjoy like the because the anniversary happened and they had all of those, the updates, the interviews, and like people talking about it years later? Like, did you enjoy all of that? Like just them revisiting it and
as a fan, I really enjoyed that. As a fan, I really liked it. And then Sarah Michelle Gellar is saying like, I'm sorry, but I was always a Buffy and Angel fan. And that's her saying an opinion about herself. Like she's not saying it's better or worse. Like she literally made a comment about how it's not better or worse, it's just how I feel as someone who like knows, like consumes the story as well, So I thought that was really, really fun. But I think that's very different from saying, I think this kind of almost paratext, where like we have information from the mouth of the people involved making it like that. I think that's very different from like saying things that like are like almost added on to the canon. Like I feel like often stuff that's added onto the canon feels like an imposition in a weird way.
Oftentimes I feel almost it's a fix-it or an afterthought. There was lots of that for the DCEU when it came to like, oh, like the suit and the thing. Does that mean that Jason was there and that he died? And then there was all this, well, yes, Jason was there and perhaps Harley helped kill him. And it's like, well, now you have all these add-ons that people take as canon that you add to the story that if you take them affect how you should look at the characters. And lots of times I do feel that creators, maybe not even necessarily that they didn't think about it, but they maybe didn't think people would care as much. Or, like you said, for depending on how old a work is, maybe it was just a different time. And so then all of a sudden they're being asked these questions, and I feel that sometimes people just feel they need to come up with an answer because they don't want to say, I didn't think about that, or...
Yeah, and I mean, someone's asking you, so, like... I mean, it's difficult because, like, I'm very much a proponent of the fourth wall, don't ask the creators things, don't contact the creators about your fanfic or your fan works or someone else's fan art, which always makes me cringe when I hear about that. Like, the fan artist probably doesn't want you to do that, but like that kind of thing, like, that's how I feel, but that's not how other people feel. And if they want to like then ask questions, then I kind of feel like I'm not going to blame a creator for engaging, because that's like a nice thing to do that they don't have to do. And whether they do it for just to make the fans happy or whether they do it because they think they'll sell more stuff if they do it, I don't actually, care, because I also want them to be able to make more stuff.
It's difficult. I feel like as a creator
yeah.
these days, you're almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't talk, people get, why aren't you talking? I want to hear answers, and why don't you engage with your fans, and you're being standoffish. But if you do talk, then you have the other side of people who are like, why are you talking to your fans? You talk too much. Sit down and be quiet. So it's just, you can't please everybody. So I just feel that the best thing to do is to be genuine. Like whenever I hear J.K. Rowling stuff, I'm like, you know what? She clearly genuinely cares about her world and genuinely wants to add to it. Go for it. And if people don't like it, because for me, when I think about fandom, if you don't like it, for me, that's what the fan fiction in that world is for. If you don't like it, then you don't have to take it. You don't like Harry and Hermione, don't write about them, don't ship them. That's fine. Do your thing.
I mean, also, I feel like there's the same kind of then conversations going on in fandom itself, where it's like, when you're in fandom and you're like going around like the archive or Tumblr or something like that, and you're reading loads of stuff, you're like, that there's often a kind of like recurring narrative that's established, like the fact that we care about it enough and we do enough stuff and we make enough like transformative works that we end up with like a Fannish canon. Like we end up with this fanon that's like, yeah, well, this is the canon of the show, but this is what the fandom cares about, and these are two separate things. Like, because I'm in Les Mis fandom, and Les Mis fandom like really focuses really heavily on like a small group of characters that are not like the main focus of the actual like works, like any of the works. They're definitely in there, but they're not like the main story. Like they're not present throughout all of the story and all that. And there's a lot of incidental stuff that kind of is always repeated in the background of every fic, and it's like, it's not actually necessarily in the work, it's just something that like the fandom really likes and like has kind of grabbed onto. And that the fact that comes up in every fandom, like that makes me super happy that that's a thing that's going on in fandom. But also it's like, I can't imagine like if you're a creator being confronted not only with like people who care about it so much, who like probably know the thing better than you and are like correcting you on what happened in episode 12 of season 5, and then like also are like, oh, but so and so has a red umbrella of whatever, because that's in every fic. It's not really in the thing, but like, I like when people try. I'm not surprised that it often doesn't really work, for fans, like almost like you were saying, like damn if you do, damn if you don't. I think I appreciate what I feel like is a genuine try from people to engage and to like, be, this being so much of this portrayal of fandom that's like, here's some crazy teenage girls who are like obsessed with the thing, and it's like, first of all, they're buying your stuff, so stop being rude to them. Second of all, like loads of us are actually older than that.
And it's so much more multifaceted and varied than they ever depict it as. And it does bother me that you only, in the mainstream at least, you only see the stories about when it goes wrong, not about all the wonderful charity drives or the wonderful get-togethers or the really great fun things that fans produce that are really awesome and exciting and deserve just as much attention. But all you're going to hear about is, Clance blackmail or that kind of thing. You're not going to hear about the positive sides, because there is very much that mainstream narrative still, I'm finding, even though it is slowly beginning to be chipped away, that fandom is this odd subculture of people who are a bit too into something, and maybe they should calm down. But it makes us
happy.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, there's plenty of people that are a bit too into football.
Yeah.
And, like, no one's like, the thing is, for me, fandom is very much about the affect. It's very much about, like, the feels, And, like, if I care about something, then I'm, fanish about it. And I think the kind of fan, like, I think fandom and like being a fan for me is like always about your behaviors. It's always about, for me, it's always about like how it makes me feel, what it makes me do, like how I engage with the stuff. And then that's not necessarily, I think a lot of like media, mainstream culture generally sees it about like not necessarily about the behavior that you have, but more about like what kind of person you are and what kind of thing you're talking about. Because I think you know, they're like, oh, fandom, oh, it's about like Star Trek or something, you know, and it's like,
or
yes,
they
but
pick apart. It's interesting. Like, for example, Star Wars, the ship that's very much reported on mostly now, it's Rayla, but it was Storm Pilot.
yeah,
But for the year, if you actually went into the fandom, it was not necessarily the predominant one being shared or talked about. So there was this interesting thing where there was the public perception of this is what's happening in fandom versus being in the fandom and actually seeing, well, it's part of what's happening, but it's definitely not all of it. And that's always interesting as a fan. But I think with anything, whether you're a fan of it or not, whenever you're reading anything, always take it with a grain of salt and always maybe go and check it out yourself. Because whenever I see anybody talk about anything, be it a wine review, a sports thing, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go and check and double check some of these, you know, I'm going to get some receipts and see if that's actually, and I actually
well, yeah, because when someone talks about your thing in such like broad terms and you're like, well, that's not really, it's not false, but it's not like,
it's not
actually
accurate either.
So yeah,
I thought you brought up a really interesting point about fans knowing more about the material than the creators themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's very accurate, because I think what lots of fans and creators don't realize is that the thing when you're creating something and you're so into it, there are so many more factors that you have to think about. You have to think about the money, you got to think about demographics, you got to think about all the other stuff. You're moving on to other projects, you're doing all kinds of things. But for fans, like, for example, Buffy, it can be a fandom that you get into and you stick with and it's part of it and you rewatch it and you get into it. But for, say, Joss Whedon or something, he has been off creating tons of other things and working on other works. And so then to come back and jump right back into it and, you know, be in that mind, like, it's just that you are in a very different setting, like mental setting, than the creators. And I feel that that's something people don't always think about, you know?
But also with Buffy, like, Joss's mindset when he created it, he always said was about, like, you know, about turning stereotypes on their heads and having like the pretty girl fighting the monsters instead of running away. And, you know, like, for him it was a very feminist concept in his head all along. And like, if you're watching it in 2017 and you have some things that you're like, whoa, that doesn't really come across really great actually right now. But like, clearly for the people involved in making it 20 years ago, like 20 years ago, it was cutting edge. Like, you know, maybe right now you're like watching it and you're like, oh my God, kill your gays tropes. But at the time it was the first kiss or something, like, you know, like, I don't know if it was actually the first lesbian kiss on TV or network, or like, I actually don't know how it aired in the US, so I can't really, you know, speak to that. But it was definitely something that was progressive. I mean, I remember being a kid and it surprised me and I thought that it was great that it went there, you know. So it made, you know, it made an impact on me at the time. And I'm sure when they wrote it, they must have had to fight the network on it quite a bit. I mean, you know, Tara and Willow don't even kiss until they've been together for, you know, ages, because they can just hold hands and do magic, because that's how lesbians have sex.
Magic. And I agree. I think it's important to contextualize things, to always remember where things are coming from. Like, a big moment for me in fandom, I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I love Star Trek. And the first interracial kiss is attributed to the TOS. It is not actually the first interracial one, but it may be the first between a Caucasian man and an African American woman. Yeah. And that was the first time I'd ever seen people with the same relationship as my parents kiss on screen. And to get that kind of shot, they actually had to do all kinds of things. I've read the behind the scenes. They had to turn the camera away so you couldn't actually see it. They had to make it that they were kissing against their will. Aliens were manipulating them. It wasn't something that they were actually going to do. But I just toss all that aside. I'm like, you know what? For the time, good for them. They managed to get something on.
But there's the impact that it makes, you know?
Yeah.
There's the impact that it makes, because, like, maybe Tara and Willow couldn't kiss for a really long time, but, like, I was a straight kid in a, like, you know, progressive liberal family where, like, we knew that, you know, we shouldn't discriminate because discrimination is bad, but we, like, had never met LGBTQ plus people at the time, you know, 'cause I was like 13 or 14 and I was like in a very kind of sheltered environment. And I mean, I'm sure there were LGBTQ plus kids in my school and whatever, they just hadn't told me about it, you know. But at the time, like, I remember when Buffy and Willow had this conversation, Willow was like, can't go back to Oz because of Tara, and Willow and Buffy goes, oh, does Tara fancy Oz? And I was like, yeah, pretty much same, right? Because I just never really thought about it in any other way, because, like, you know, I like boys. And it's just like, you know, I kind of went like, oh, at the same time as Buffy, and then I was on board with it because it was super cute. But, you know, I can't imagine like how important that must have been to someone who was like struggling with their own identity and how that might be perceived by the outside world. Because like, for me, that like scans as something important in my memory, as like, oh, this is like cool and not something that I've seen before, and it's like really, you know, interesting, and it's doing something different. And like, yeah, it makes sense also, you know, like you look at them, it's like, oh yeah, I've not thought of it in that way, but it definitely makes sense, you know, like. And I think you look back on it and you're like, well, maybe Joss Whedon was being a bit gross when he would, maybe Joss Whedon was doing plenty of things that were gross, you know, in like many different ways, but like still this got made. And it's really, and also one of the difficult things about TV is that people often think of it as a one-person show, you know, because there's a showrunner and because they have the name showrunner, and you're like, Buffy, Joss Whedon, and then like, we're going to, you know, be angry about something on Doctor Who, it must be because Stephen Moffat is terrible. And, you know, I'm sure there are plenty of things that I wish Stephen Moffat did differently, or like communicated differently. However, they asked Emma Benson to come back to be the first evil, and she was like, no, because people had told her how much it meant to her that Tara was a character who was there and who was a lesbian and who wasn't evil, or presented as, you know, insane, or, you know, and we know that there were issues with those tropes being used also in the show, but they weren't used for Tara, and she decided not to come back to be the first evil, which, you know, is where you get this great episode where I can't remember the girl's name, who shows up and talks to Willow through, you know, gives Willow messages from Tara, but, you know, she decided not to come back for that reason. And that's like also something that has a certain impact on what the show is, you know. The woman who plays Jenny Calendar became very religious and didn't come back as the first evil, also because she didn't want to be, you know, super evil or
to be a demon.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many things that impact the making of a show that it becomes really difficult to, like, you know, this whole creator to fan relationship, then it's like, yeah, it's such a big machine that it's then really difficult to, you know, like isolate it in that way.
Yeah, in a way, the person whose ever name it is does end up a bit suffering for it, because people hyper focus and they end up getting all of the attention, be it positive or negative.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure, you know, I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, poor Joss Whedon, it's been so bad for his career or whatever, you know, like, but, and in the same way that with Moffat, I think he just does not behave very well. I'm sure there's some like really, I'm sure it's a lot to take, right? Like the kind of attention and the kind of criticism and whatever that must come with that. I'm sure it's a lot.
I can't imagine.
Like, behaves terribly. Like,
no, I can't even imagine it. And like, some people just can't handle their social media, but I can't imagine it either. It's interesting. I'll say this about communicating now. It's very interesting and it's very nebulous. And that's why when people bring up stuff about, you know, classes, about, you know, like online communication and just about chatting and talking to people, I don't have a problem with it. Like, some people are like, just let people do. And I'm like, I don't think there's any problem with having people discuss how we should interact with one another, because it is relatively new in the scheme of human communication. So
because people view it in so many different ways, you know, some people view it the same as like being in person, some people view it as like completely different because it's online, and then that means that we have different ideas of what's appropriate or not appropriate to do. And so like I think that's really, really necessary, particularly when like so many things that would have been, you know, offline IRL beforehand turn out to be now online, you know, like here's a professional conference or whatever and it's all online. It's like, yeah, but you need to like establish, you know, what is appropriate or not, because otherwise, you know, but I'm one of the things that I'm super excited about next year is that Britta Ludden, who's a writer on Riverdale, she's writing a novel that's like about like fans and creators interacting.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's called Ship It, and it's like basically the premise of the book is like this girl goes to Comic-Con and asks like the main actor on like her show about like how he's totally in love with this other character on the show, and he's like no, because he's not thought about it and he thinks it's really weird, and that goes like virally, you know, bad for the show. And the show's like, oh sorry, please fangirl, random fangirl, please come on our summer press tour and make us look better, please. And it's about that, and it's like that's such a cool premise, because like
that sounds really interesting.
She was in Fandom before like being on Riverdale, and well, being a writer for it, and like Riverdale has had issues with the and it's like, yeah, that sounds so interesting to me. I'm like, yes, please tell me more about this like creator fan kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, no, I'm excited for that. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So I'm always looking for like books about fandom, because there have been like a few this year, and like, yeah, I was super excited. At some point you mentioned that you were going to do some book stuff, and I'm like, yes. Please talk about all the Fannish books. It's like, yes.
No, I can finally start to read again. My daughter finally has a relatively reasonable nap schedule, so I can actually pick up a book. I'm so excited because I missed reading so much. But I got into podcasts, which was fantastic. That's a lot of fun.
Well, you need to listen to Buffering, because it's so great. It
sounds great.
It's so great. Like the other Buffy podcasts that I was listening to, like they were great and they were very analytical, but they were like, they were, I think, more critical in a way, whereas I think what I love about Buffering is that Kristen and Jenny, like, they'll talk about how, oh, this thing is a bit terrible. They also take great amounts of joy in the show still, you know, like they also, you can tell it's still a really joyful thing for them, and it's not getting bogged down in like, oh my God, this is kind of like a really old fashioned now, you know? And I think that's like the way that I still want to enjoy, you know, things that I love. Like I want to be analytical and critical, but I also want to let myself like
have fun,
still love the thing, you know?
Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. It was a lot of fun, and I hope you had fun too.
Yeah, no, that was great. Like, it's always fairly special to like get to talk to someone that you've been watching for a while, and you've been like looking at their work and going like, oh, so great.
So it was really great to talk about Buffy, because I haven't had the chance to do that. So, and I hope people check out all of the podcasts that we talked about, because it's gonna be a good time. And speaking of, you should re-shill all of your stuff.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel about books, which is called Claire Russo, which is my full name, which is annoying for English speakers to spell, so I will give you links that you can put in the show notes. I have a podcast called Radio Free Fandom, where I talk to a different guest each episode about Fannish things. So it's very much, you know, doesn't really have a like unified theme. It's a bit of a grab bag, and that's how I like to have it. And I also I'm on the Twitter at Claire Russo, and I talk about politics and cats a lot.
Awesome. So I will put all of your links down below, and thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
See ya. Hello, troopers who made it all the way to the end. Thank you so much. Now, of course, the test to see that you actually made it. What was your favorite season of Buffy, if you've seen it? If not, put that down there too. I'm very curious to see how you guys feel about this show. As always, thank you so much for watching, or in this case, most likely listening, as it is, yes, they're long, but I love them. We have lots more videos coming up soon, and I look forward to seeing you all again and spending some time shipping and hanging out in fandom. I appreciate all of you guys, and until next time, let's get to that outro. Bye-bye. This has been Shipper's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Special thanks to all of my patrons, names on the side, for helping me with this increase in videos. As mentioned, there is plenty more coming up, so please stay tuned, for there are as many ships out there as there are stars in the sky.